welcome everyone to Snowed Under, a new segment for my, I guess you could say my Tolkien podcast called Exploring Arda. Like I said in the introduction, this is kind of like a segment of my channel where I ask you guys some questions, or if you guys ask me questions, of anything about Tolkien's Legendarium. Pretty much anything from Lord of the Rings to The Hobbit to Silmarillion to even Tolkien's own life, and I'll be doing these short episodes of just kind of like answering your guys' questions. So definitely send it over my way, and I'll put it in the description. And so I think I'm just gonna go right into the first question that I have for this new segment, and I think it was pretty cool to include it for the first one. This one actually came from my wife, and she asks, what was the best era in the Middle-earth Kingdom and why? So, when most of us think of Middle-earth, most of us kind of immediately go to Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, which is set in the Third Age. And I guess you could say more precisely at the end of the Third Age. So, when I think of Middle-earth, I personally switch Middle-earth to Arda, as Arda is the world in which Middle-earth is in. And that's why it's called Exploring Arda for my podcast, because we're exploring literally the world of Arda that Tolkien created. But, with that being said, Arda actually has 4 ages that are at least decently well known, though the 4th age wasn't really completed through writing. After the destruction of the ring and the defeat of Sauron, it took a few years to attain peace, but through Aragorn's efforts, the Age of Men began, and not too late after, the 4th Age began. I think a lot of people who aren't as deep into the lore or like the story of Lord of the Rings remember that there's a brief glimpse into the 4th Age. So, when you ask what's the best era of Middle-earth, there can be a lot of answers. For me, like most fans, the 3rd Age during the story of Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit is my personal favorite, and I'll explain a few reasons why. However, as close second place comes with the 1st Age, which is where the grandiose tome of the Silmarillion originates. And while I was writing this, I thought it would be best to pretty much highlight parts of the 2nd Age. So really, for this episode, I'm going to be going through some really incredible tales of the 3 ages of Arda, and I'll let you, as the audience, pick which era or age is your favorite. So I'll basically highlight one story from each of the 3rd ages, and hopefully you can kind of like be curious of everything else. So let's start at the very beginning of Arda. Before the setting of Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, there is the Silmarillion, which is basically like the history of Arda. Now, Arda, like I mentioned, is the entire world in which Middle-earth is a part of. This includes, Valinor, the Undying Lands, and Tolkien's own version of Atlantis called Numenor. At least I like to think of Numenor as his own tale of Atlantis, so yeah. When Arda was created, there was one almighty figure called Eru Ilúvatar. He's the creator of all and basically the god of Arda. Now, he was so immensely powerful that he made beings through his thought alone, and he named them the Ainur. And through the help of the Ainur, which in the Silmarillion is called the music of the Ainur, they crafted the world of Arda. I absolutely love the creation story of Arda. The shaping of a world through thought and music. It's not only creative, personal, and full of connection, but it's also intriguing, awe-inspiring, and immensely complex. But, if you'd like me to go into a separate deep dive of this creation of Arda, definitely let me know. Because we all know that it takes one villain to ruin the harmony. The villain of the Silmarillion was originally called Melkor, one of the Ainur, but was later renamed to Morgoth when his evil dark magic spread throughout Arda. Morgoth becomes the main villain of the Silmarillion once he's defeated by the Ainur, who are renamed to the Valar. And if that seems kind of confusing, don't worry. The Silmarillion has many, many names for a lot of characters and places. And, maybe I should make some sort of, crash course for the Silmarillion. But anyway, I'll tell a brief moment in the Silmarillion that will hopefully catch your attention, and that story is none other than Beren and Luthien, a well-known tale in the book if you've kind of skimmed through Tolkien's other stories. So yeah, this story is definitely one that I hope to persuade audiences to read, at least this one thing. The tale, Beren and Luthien, follows the adventures of Beren, a mortal man who falls in love with an elven princess, Luthien. Sounds familiar, right? It's very similar to the Third Age story of Aragorn and Arwen. And if my memory is somewhat accurate, I remember reading that Arwen's beauty was compared to that of Luthien, and that is one of the most highest praises that any elven lady could get. But anyway, back to Beren and his undying love for Luthien. His passionate love for Luthien got him all the way up to King Thingol, Luthien's father, an elven lord who ruled the lands of Doriath. However, King Thingol thought he was clever and told Beren that if he wanted to win Luthien's hand in marriage, Beren would have to snatch one of the Silmarils, one of the holy jewels of the Valar, from Morgoth's Iron Crown because he stole them. Beren, to Thingol's surprise, took to the challenge immediately and set off. Luthien ultimately escapes the lands of Doriath to go after Beren when he's captured by none other than Sauron. Yeah, Sauron is from the very first age. He's old. During the time of Beren and Luthien, he was actually called Thu, and he was a shapeshifter and ruled over an island called Tol in Garhoth, or the Isle of Werewolves. When Luthien arrives, she's accompanied by Huan, the Hound of Valinor. Together, they defeat Sauron and banish him from the land. Afterward, they go to the gates of Angband itself, the lair of Morgoth, and through cunning songs of Luthien's enchanting magic, they snatch one of the Silmarils. But during their escape, Karkaroth, the Hellhound, chases them and bites off the hand of Beren, the same one that had the Silmaril. Once Beren and Luthien return to Doriath, Beren allies with King Thingol, and they take down Karkaroth with the help of Huan once again. However, Beren is poisoned from the bite and dies from his wounds. Luthien's love, though, was so strong for Beren that when she pleaded with the Valar, they granted both of them mortal life again. They then live, happily ever after. Now, there's a lot of things that go on in this story that I didn't mention, so you think of this as a very, very brief summary of what happens, as the story also occurs during the Wars of Morgoth against the Elves, or, what I like to call the Wars of Beleriand, as Beleriand was the land that most of the battles were fought on. In fact, there was so much battle, strife, and violence that after the wars were done, the lands were practically sunk into the ocean and were just no more. So, if that doesn't spell, cosmic strife, I don't know what else does. Moving on to the Second Age, like I mentioned earlier, the Second Age was known for the fall of Numenor, but also for the forging of the Rings of Power. I said earlier that Sauron was banished from Tol in Garhoth, but like he tends to do, his spirit retreats and flies somewhere else. So, this happens to Sauron quite a bit. And I'll let you know the other times when we get to cover this Second Age and the Third Age. The first, like I said, is in the Silmarillion, and the second time is during his time at Numenor itself, the actual island. After the permanent banishment of Morgoth, the enemy of Arda from the First Age, Sauron rose to power as he was almost equally as terrifying as Morgoth. Sauron pushed war against Arda again, and one of the people that irritated him, for the most part, were the Númenóreans. Now, these people were mortals who were gifted with long life. Numenor was the closest mortal settlement to Valinor, and occasionally saw the lights of Valinor itself. They joined the defenses and causes against Sauron, and fought back viciously, including Elendil, who was the father of Isildur, and if you've watched the films, you'll know who Isildur is, the one who basically is ensnared by the power of the One Ring and all that. So, but how did the island of Numenor sink? I say the fall of Numenor, and this grand island is the Atlantis of Tolkien's Legendarium. So, of course, how did it sink then? Well, during Sauron's reign, he crafted the Rings of Power and began to give them out to others, hoping the races of men, elves, and dwarves just would take them right away. But the elves were cautious and the dwarves were wary, but mankind was easily swayed to Sauron's will. There were some who were caught under the Ring's influence that were Númenórean as well. With Sauron's hatred against the Númenóreans, he actually tricked the king Ar-Pharazôn so that he could go to the island without any attacks or invasions. While Sauron was kept captive, though, the influence of the One Ring seeped out and spread across Numenor, and ultimately to Ar-Pharazôn himself. There was even a moment where Sauron started a cult, pretty much, which is bizarre, but effective. The days turned dark, and eventually the king thought he was so powerful that he could invade Valinor itself, the actual Undying Lands. He challenged the Valar by stepping foot on Valinor with violence in his heart, and that was basically where Eru Ilúvatar himself intervened, smiting the king and his army and sinking the island of Númenor in mighty wrath. Of course, with the island's destruction, Sauron's physical form was crushed, but his, second spiritual escape occurred and he fled into Middle-earth as a spirit. The might of the Valar and of Ilúvatar was displayed, and the Númenorians were nearly wiped out. And one last cool note to add, actually, is that when they escaped to Middle-earth, the Númenorians, some of the items that were spread across the lands were the Palantiri, or the Palantir, the same ones that Saruman uses during the Lord of the Rings. The Dunedain, or the exile Númenorians, set the Seeing Stones across Middle-earth to communicate with one another. Well, eventually a few of them were, rumored to be lost, and by the time Sauron began his next war, Saruman had the possession of one of them, using it, obviously, for the wrong reasons. Now, lastly, we turn to the famous Third Age, where the grandiose stories of the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit occur. Now, the Third Age began when the last alliance of mankind and elves stood up against Sauron, and in the lands of Mordor, not only challenged him, but defeated him. But since the One Ring was not destroyed, Sauron's spirit endured, and he continued to linger in Middle-earth. A couple of hundred years after Sauron's defeat, the Order of Wizards were sent to Middle-earth to help combat the rising threats of Sauron. The Order of Wizards included Gandalf, Saruman, Radagast, and the Blue Wizards, Alatar, and Palando. Gandalf had originally urged the White Council, which included the wizards Elrond, Galadriel, and potentially Círdan the Shipwright, to press advances against a place called Dol Guldur in the lands of Mirkwood. We actually do see this during The Hobbit, but Gandalf had actually his guesses about Sauron's return long before this moment. Sauron was then known as the Necromancer. Saruman, being under the influence of the One Ring, denied the claims, though, and Sauron fled from the location. During this time, of course, are the years of Bilbo Baggins' adventures and his accidental stumbling upon pretty much the greatest piece of jewelry of all time. So while he joined the dwarves of Erebor to reclaim their quest, Smaug, the last dragon of Middle-earth, was slain by Bard the Bowman. Bilbo returns to the Shire with the One Ring, and because of it, Gollum, or Smeagol, actually goes out of his caves for once to look for the thief. Eventually, Gollum is caught by Sauron, and he pretty much spills the secrets about the Shire and Baggins and all that stuff. This leads into the extremely famous story of The Lord of the Rings, which follows the journeys of Frodo Baggins and Samwise Gamgee as they pretty much carry the One Ring from the Shire all the way to Mordor, and, Sam Gamgee being the absolute truest and best friend in all of fantasy. The War of Sauron against the free peoples of Middle-earth, erupts during this time. Sieges against cities, the reemergence of the Ents, the terror of Sauron's servants, the Ring Race, the nearly forgotten demons called the Balrogs, all sorts of chaotic, courageous, and catastrophic events. There you go. All that stuff takes place all at once. But, of all beings that defeated Sauron, I would say, again, were the hobbits, the most peaceful people in all of Arda. So, he keeps getting defeated time and time again, but, the one time where the ring is defeated, it's from hobbits. And, here's where I mentioned that, Sauron, although he is defeated, seems to, once again, flee from the scene. And it's curious because there's really no mention of Sauron being, killed, you would say. But he is kind of banished, so it's interesting. And that could be a whole nother theme for another day. But the defeat of Sauron is similar between the films and the books, and it signifies the banishment of evil from Mordor. And, that's kind of what it is. We got to banish the evil, and then, they take over whatever that they claimed afterward. But, it's something to wonder about the whole, actual defeat of Sauron. And, although I could pinpoint 100 different events for the Third Age of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, I'll have to say that for another episode. So if you guys want to have me cover an episode purely on the Third Age of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, definitely let me know. So, but now that I've covered, a few stories from, first, second, and third age, what do you think is your favorite era from what I've spoken about? Did I do a decent enough job of answering the question? Because I really hope so. I think, personally, still the third age remains to be my favorite, for many, many reasons. With so much historical knowledge, Middle-earth feels so full already in the third age. And I'm sure that a few of the key figures during The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings knew about Sauron's origin from the first age, being a servant to Morgoth himself and ultimately, causing the downfall of Numenor. So having a villain with thousands of years of terrible deeds and the near destruction of an entire people, it makes the stakes of Middle-earth survival so much higher. Yet, even with so much, cunning and thoughts and all that's in planning and scheming, Sauron was ultimately defeated by hobbits, which is kind of funny and still, very moving and powerful at the same time. From the third age, we, as the audience, we get to experience, all, very, very, so many elements, I guess you could say, of epic fantasy, from lore building to the character development to the strife among the people and the constant struggle of the light against the dark. And I could probably talk about that on and on about the themes of the Lord of the Rings, but I've received a different letter about that. So it'll be for another episode, and I think it'll be a good one. So, with all that rambling and reading out of the way, I think this question, although it's answered in a rather extensive way, I think it's pretty well thought out. But be sure to, send your own questions my way. It's very, very welcomed. And yeah, I had a fun time answering this question and kind of rambling all about the history of Middle-earth. So, now that it is another letter up ahead, hopefully you guys send in your next letter so we can get that mailbox snowed under once again.